My name is Carolyn, and yes, I'm 34 now. I can stand up straight in a conference room and not be intimidated by loud male voices. I earn money with my wits and my tongue. I can smile when I need to and keep quiet when I need to. I have a mortgage on an apartment I bought 3 years ago, and I have another one, inherited from Grandma Ruth when her heart stopped one day, leaving me standing in a cold kitchen amid the smell of old books and dried herbs. But honestly, all this, the work, the money, the apartments, is just the tip of the iceberg, behind which lies what made me who I am. Let me take you back there, to when I was a child, because that's where my real story began. I was 10 when the world split in two, when my father, my only stronghold and protector, suddenly collapsed in the kitchen, clutching his chest, and within minutes, he was gone. Just the day before, he'd held my bike while I staggered around the yard, taught me not to be afraid of falling, and laughed when I flew straight into the lilac bushes, then wiped my tears with his big palms. And then the next day, he was gone. And the silence that descended on our house was so thick and heavy that I felt like I was suffocating. Mom seemed hollow inside, walking around with dull eyes and not knowing what to do with her hands. And I, small and confused, clung to her dress, waiting for her to return to her old self. But it never happened. A year later, she brought Steve home. I remember his smile, broad like someone who never cared about anything, and her eyes, alive for the first time since Dad's death. She laughed again, put on lipstick again, and even started playing records in the evenings. Honestly, I thought back then that maybe life would give us a second chance, that this man could fill the hole my father left. And for a while, it seemed that way. But when I turned 12 and my mother gave birth to my half-sister Emma, everything in the house changed beyond recognition. From that day on, it was as if I became invisible. Mom was lost in caring for the baby. Steve hovered around the crib as if his own daughter were the only one in the world. And me? I found myself an unpaid nanny and housekeeper. "Carolyn, watch Emma while I shower," Mom would snap without turning around. "Girl, go wash the dishes," Steve muttered from behind the newspaper. "Emma needs a bottle," Mom would yell from the other room, and it all felt like an endless loop with no escape. I was only 13, but the work of a grown woman hung on my shoulders. Diapers, pots and pans, rags, and a fatigue that made me nod off in class. My grades slipped, and the teachers shook their heads. But what did they know about me ironing school uniforms and wiping milk off the floor at night, while my peers played in the yard or chatted with their friends on the phone? I had no friends because after school I always hurried home. Emma was waiting for me, a ton of things to do, and no one asked me what I wanted. One day, Grandma Ruth arrived. Stern, straightforward, my father's mother. She sat in a chair in our cramped living room, watching Mom and Steve bark orders at me as if I were a servant, and said nothing. But exactly an hour later, she dragged Mom into the kitchen, thinking I wouldn't hear a word, and I sat in the corner, hanging on every word. "Patricia, this girl is miserable," Grandma said bluntly, her voice cold and hard as a knife. Mom muttered something in response. "Ruth, I'm in trouble. I need Carolyn's help." And her voice was defensive, pitiful. Grandma didn't relent. "She's not your maid. She's your daughter. When was the last time you saw her smile?" There was a long, heavy pause, and then Mom exhaled. "I don't know what you want from me. I can't be in 2 places at once. Let her come live with you." And then Steve interjected, his voice lazy, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Actually, this might work better." And in that moment, I realized he was glad to be rid of me. I saw the relief on his face when they returned to the living room. Mom looked at me, clutching a sleepy Emma, and said, "Darling, would you like to stay with Grandma Ruth?" I didn't hesitate for a second. Yes. Steve even chuckled, as if he'd finally dropped the weight off his shoulders. Mom nodded, as if she'd been waiting for this answer. "Okay, then we'll arrange everything." That same day, I packed my few belongings, a few dresses, a stack of notebooks, my favorite books. I left behind a room that had never felt like my own because it held neither the warmth nor my laughter. And when I crossed the threshold of Grandma's apartment, I felt like I'd entered another world. Tall shelves of books, the smell of ink and dust, heavy curtains and lamplight falling on her desk, littered with notes and an old quill. She was a literature professor, and every corner of her house exuded knowledge. Every evening we sat at the table where there was always real food prepared by her own hands and talked about everything: school, books, movies, how life works. She looked at me on the first day and said, "You're not cleaning my house, Carolyn. That's my job. Your job is to be a child and learn." I almost cried because it sounded too good to be true. For the first time in a long time, no one was yelling at me, barking commands at me, demanding bottles or dirty dishes. Grandma seemed happy to have me around, and it was a new, frightening, and wonderful feeling to be wanted. 4 months after I moved in with Grandma and experienced my first taste of freedom and dignity, she sat me down at the table, poured tea into her favorite china with delicate blue flowers, and looked at me in a way that immediately told me this was going to be a serious conversation. "I've officially adopted you, dear," she said, her voice steady, though her hands shook slightly as she raised the cup to her lips. I froze, staring at her wide-eyed, and then breathed out, "What does that mean?" She put the cup down and replied as if she were giving a lecture at her university. "It means you're now legally my daughter, and this house is your home, for as long as you want it to be." I remember feeling torn in two at that moment. One part of me crushed by the realization that my own mother had so easily discarded me, as if I were something unwanted, superfluous, like an old chair being carried out into the street. And the other, stronger part, sighed with relief for the first time, because here was someone who truly wanted me, and that meant everything to me. After that, my life began to change. My grades suddenly went up, I started bringing home A's again, and the teachers no longer shook their heads but smiled because they saw I'd stopped falling asleep in class. At school, I finally made friends, real friends with whom we laughed, shared secrets, argued over boys, and in the evenings I'd sit up late with books from my grandmother's collection, devouring them one after another, as if I were starving. I learned to breathe deeply. For the first time since the day Dad died, I felt like I belonged somewhere, that I had a home and someone who looked at me with pride, not irritation. I rarely saw Mom, Steve, and Emma. On holidays or birthdays, I'd show up at their house, and everything there was tense, polite. But in my mom's eyes, there always glimmered the same relief I'd seen the first time she agreed to give me to my grandmother. They were polite, smiling, offering me a piece of cake, but as soon as I stood up and said goodbye, I noticed their shoulders slump, as if the room had grown lighter again without my presence. My mother posted dozens of photos of Emma on social media, her first steps, her school parties, her birthdays, her Halloween costume, but I couldn't find a single photo of myself, as if I'd never existed. At some point, I even stopped visiting her page, because what was the point of looking at proof that I'd been erased from their lives? I graduated with honors, went to college on a scholarship, and earned a degree in communications. My grandmother was so proud of me that when my name was called at graduation, she cried right there in the hall, openly, and I saw the joy in her eyes that I sorely missed from my mother. After college, I quickly found a job at a good company, and my grandmother helped me settle in. Then I was able to move into my own place and feel like a grown, independent woman. And then, as if sensing that I was now firmly on my feet, my mother suddenly decided to get in touch again. The call was unexpected. At first, I even thought I misheard. "Carolyn, dear, I think we should start over. Put the past behind us." Her voice was tensely soft, as if she'd been rehearsing the phrase in front of a mirror. Curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to give it a try. We started seeing each other on holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Emma's birthdays. I'd arrive bearing gifts, expensive, beautiful ones, designed to show that I'd accomplished something. Emma, who was already a teenager by then, opened my boxes with a slight laziness. Mom and Steve exchanged glances, and I saw silent approval on their faces, as if they'd decided Carolyn had finally found her role, the role of the generous older sister who brings gifts. Emma never seemed particularly grateful, but I excused her. Teenagers are like that. Nothing's right for them, nothing's enough, and I hoped that with time she'd warm up to me. So the years went on. We weren't close, but we maintained the semblance of a normal relationship, and I sometimes even thought that was the best we could hope for in our story. Not love, but at least polite coexistence. And then last year, my grandmother died. She was 89. She lived a long life, and everyone said her passing was quiet and dignified. But for me, it was a loss that left a hole in my chest. She was the only real parent I ever knew, and her death broke my heart so much that to this day, I sometimes find myself wanting to call her and tell her about it. When her will was read, I learned that she left me her apartment and $150,000, and it felt less like a gift than a heavy burden, because I would give anything to have her back. But that wasn't even the most astonishing thing. I learned that the house Mom and Steve had lived in all this time also belonged to my grandmother. She'd owned it for decades, and when my father died, out of pity and kindness, she'd let Mom stay there. It was a shock. For so many years, I'd thought they were living their own lives, and it turned out their lives were held together by my grandmother's generosity. I didn't know what to make of this information and decided to leave it at that, because Mom had never mentioned it, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin her illusion of independence. A few weeks later, Mom called me and asked if Emma could live in Grandma's apartment while she went to college, and I said yes because it felt right, even though I was losing my steady rental income. I wanted to believe we were building something resembling a family, that we were healing old wounds. And for a while, that's exactly how it looked. We'd gather, laugh at the table, take photos, and I thought maybe we'd finally made it as a happy family, or at least that's what I thought. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a dry press release about a new product launch, skimming over those polished phrases that should have sounded like an inspiring anthem, but were, in reality, a dull hodgepodge of corporate garbage, when suddenly the phone rang and Mom's name appeared on the screen. I almost ignored the call because we usually only spoke on holidays, and even then, only casually. But something inside me tugged, some old nagging feeling that if I didn't pick up, something bad would happen. "Hi, Mom," I said carefully. "What happened?" "Darling." Her voice was soft, a little cloying. "I'm calling about Emma's graduation gift." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Emma had just graduated from college a few weeks ago, and I was there, clapping my hands when her name was called, watching Mom and Steve beam with pride. And for a second, I even felt something akin to joy for them all, because they looked so happy together. "Yes, I've been thinking about that," I replied. "I was planning on sending her to Mexico for a week. Let her relax, celebrate, before looking for a job." There was silence on the other end, and it wasn't a happy silence, not a grateful one. No, it was that heavy pause I knew all too well. "Well, of course that's not bad," Mom finally said, "but I think she needs something more substantial." I frowned. My heart sank. "More substantial? Mom, a week in Mexico isn't cheap. It's a wonderful gift. Carolyn, you know that." Her voice took on that old steely edge that used to make my stomach clench as a child. "Emma's been living in your grandmother's apartment for a year now. She's used to having her own space. A young woman needs a place to live, a place to build her life." I closed my eyes, immediately understanding where she was going with this, and I didn't like it at all. "Mom," I said sharply, "Emma lives there for free. Can you imagine what other students pay for apartments like that? She's already gotten a huge deal." "Nobody's saying she has to move out," Mom interrupted, "but you could, well, consider giving her this apartment." I almost laughed with anger. "I'm not giving her the apartment, if that's what you mean," I said, and felt my fingers clench into fists. "Carolyn," my mother's voice became sharp, almost cutting, and I heard in it the same coldness that once made me cry at night. "She's your sister. Family helps family. You've always been generous. You paid for her college, supported her. How is that worse? Because helping with tuition is one thing, but giving her the apartment is quite another, I snapped. You already have your own place. You don't need 2 apartments, she said, as if I had an extra dress in my closet. I took a deep breath, trying to stay afloat, not to break down. Mom, I'm not going to explain my financial decisions to you. The trip to Mexico is a generous gift. Emma should be grateful. Grateful, she mimicked, raising her voice. After everything we've been through as a family, after we've tried so hard to mend our relationship, this is how you repay me. And what exactly am I supposed to repay? I couldn't resist. I've already done more for her than anyone. I paid for 4 years of college. I gave her a roof over her head for free when I could have made money on rent. What more do you want? I want you to do the right thing. To help your sister start her life. Her voice turned icy. Free housing is a help, Mom. It's a huge help, I replied. And there was a moment of silence on the line. I hoped she'd finally heard, finally understood. But then she said slowly and firmly, "Think about it, Carolyn. Seriously, think about it. You have a chance to do what needs to be done right now." I stared at the wall, feeling anger and resentment welling up from deep within, and exhaled, "I've thought about it." A trip to Mexico is my final offer. She didn't answer. She simply hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in my office, clutching the phone in my hand, and felt that same old knot tying itself in my stomach. A familiar one from childhood, when I knew that no matter how hard I tried, they would never be enough. They would always expect more, demand more, greedily squeeze everything they could. I shook my head, forced myself to return to the screen, to those dry lines of the press release, and decided that this conversation was over. 2 weeks passed. No calls, no messages. I almost believed that my mother understood, that she had accepted my decision, and that we would leave this topic in the past. Emma will go to Mexico, have fun, come back with a tan and new memories, and life will go on. My phone vibrated, the screen flickered, and I instinctively reached out to check it, thinking it was some work email or a newsletter notification. But it read, "Mom tagged you in a post." I froze because Mom almost never tagged me in anything. She never cared about social media, and when she did write something, it was just banal Christmas wishes. I tapped the notification and felt my blood run cold. A photo from last Christmas opened on the screen. The 4 of us standing by the Christmas tree. Mom, Steve, Emma, and me all smiling, looking like a normal, respectable family, as if we'd never had these endless squabbles and grudges, as if we were truly happy. But it wasn't the photo that made my hands shake. It was the caption underneath. Carolyn promised to give her little sister the apartment as a college graduation gift. I thank God for such a generous and kind older daughter. I reread it 3 times, hoping I'd somehow misread it, that it was a weird joke or an autocorrect error. But the words were there, and each one hit my temples. She'd publicly announced that I was giving my grandmother's apartment to Emma, as if it were a done deal. The comments were already pouring in. What a wonderful older sister. Very generous. Emma is lucky. This is what a real family should look like. You're an angel, Carolyn. I felt sick, and the air around me felt hot, as if someone had set it on fire. She'd done it deliberately, meanly, calculatedly, driving a wedge publicly so I couldn't back out. How could I write there for all to see, "This is not true"? Then I would look like either a liar or a heartless bitch who broke her own promise. My hands were shaking so badly I barely managed to dial her number. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was calm, almost cheerful. "Hi, Carolyn. What the hell did you just do?" I tried to keep my voice down because I was in the office, but the rage was choking me. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said sweetly. "The Facebook post, Mom. You told everyone I was giving the apartment to Emma. Well, isn't that right?" Her voice was light, as if she were talking about the weather. "No." I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw ached. I made it clear. The trip to Mexico is my last gift. "I thought you'd change your mind once you had time to think it over," she drawled, and there was so much venom in those words that it took my breath away. "Wait, did you lie to everyone on social media? Are you out of your mind?" This time she stopped pretending. Her voice became cold, harsh, alien. I wrote this so you couldn't refuse. I pressed my hand to my temple because the walls of the office seemed to be floating. What was all I could manage? Emma's graduation is this Saturday. We're going to Romano's. There will be about 50 people there. Family, friends, her classmates. You'll come with the deed to the apartment and the property transfer documents. Everything has to be signed and ready. I couldn't believe my ears. And if I don't? Then everyone will know you're a liar. Her voice was steely. I'll say you promised your sister an apartment and then broke your word. You work in PR, Caroline. What would it look like if word got out that you couldn't be trusted? Do you really think your company would want to keep an employee with such a reputation? I was speechless. My own mother had threatened to ruin my career, my life. You have until Saturday, she said and hung up. I sat staring at the phone, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I couldn't believe she'd actually done this, that she'd set a trap and was now trying to drive me into it like a wild animal. Desperate, I immediately called Emma, hoping she didn't know anything, that maybe I could talk her out of it. Hi, Carolyn, she answered evenly as if nothing had happened. Emma, did you see what Mom wrote on Facebook? Yes, I did. Did you know she was going to do this? There was a brief pause and then a calm, yes, we talked about it. Something inside me snapped. And you're okay with her lying and blackmailing me? Emma laughed, a real laugh, light, almost cheerful. Blackmail? Come on, Caroline, you have 2 apartments and I have none. It's not exactly fair. I earned my own apartment. I worked for it. I toiled to buy it. And you've been living in your grandmother's apartment for free for a year now. Yes, and I'm grateful for the handout, she said, and the word hit me in the face. But now I want something permanent, something of my own. A handout? I choked. I paid for your college education 4 fucking years. And I'm grateful for the charity, but this is different. This is about my future. And she hung up. That night, I sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and something heavy was pounding in my chest. Not even my heart, but a stone, as if someone had placed it inside and said, live with this now. The 3 people I'd stubbornly tried to call family for so many years had just shown me their true colors. They weren't my mother, not my sister, not some close friend, but complete strangers. Cold, cruel people who believed they could manipulate and intimidate me to the point where I'd simply meekly hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property just to maintain the appearance of being a good daughter. And suddenly, despite the nausea and anger, laughter burst out from within me, at first quiet and nervous, then louder, almost hysterical, because they thought they were so smart that they had trapped me, that I, like in childhood, would swallow everything silently just to avoid a scandal. And they had no idea that this was not the end, but only the beginning, and that this time I was not a child who could be driven into a corner. The next morning, I walked into my home office, pulled out the heavy box of documents my lawyer had given me right after my grandmother's funeral, and for the first time in a long time, I decided to lay them all out in front of me. There was the will, the property deeds, the insurance papers, all neatly folded and almost untouched because, frankly, I'd been avoiding looking at them all this time, afraid to admit that my grandmother was gone and that it was all on my shoulders now. I unfolded the will and this time read every line carefully, without a cursory glance, and at first, everything was familiar. The apartment Emma had lived in was officially mine. The $150,000 were mine, too. But then I saw a line that took my breath away. Property located at 847 Maple Street. I sat up and read it 3 times. It was the address of the house where Mom and Steve lived, the very house they'd lived in for over 20 years, the one I'd always considered their home. But according to this document, my grandmother had been the owner all this time, and now it was me. I sat there clutching the paper with my fingers, and a chill ran down my spine. This house had belonged to my grandmother, and before her, to my great-grandmother, and it turned out that when Dad died, Grandma had simply, out of kindness, allowed Mom to stay there. But it had never been Mom's house, and certainly not Steve's. I lived with this knowledge for a whole year, trying to bury it deep inside, because I didn't want to destroy anything, didn't want to rock the boat when everything seemed more or less smooth. But now they'd rocked the boat, and now it was too late to pretend everything was calm. Well, I thought, if they were going to start a war, then let them see how deep the waters run. I picked up the phone and dialed the lawyer's number. David Morrison, the same one who'd helped me buy my apartment and who could explain the most complex legal details in simple terms, so I could understand where I had rights and where I didn't. "David, it's Carolyn," I said, my voice shaking not from fear but from determination. "I need to ask you a few questions about the inheritance." "Sure, what happened?" he responded calmly. And I explained how my mother and her husband live in a house that was actually left to me by will, how they'd lived there for decades, but on paper, it was never theirs. "Do they have any rights as a tenant?" I asked bluntly. David paused for a second, and I even heard him leafing through something on the table. "Did they ever sign a lease or pay you rent? Are there any papers proving they have the right to be there?" "No," I said. "No contracts, nothing. Grandma simply gave them permission to live there after my father died. Then legally they're considered guests," he said evenly. "Or legally, licensees. You have the right to ask them to leave at any time. A formal eviction procedure wouldn't be necessary in that case." I took a deep breath and asked, "What if I still want to make it official? With paperwork, with notices?" "We can prepare eviction notices," David said. "That will create a paper trail and make it clear it's a legal matter. How much time do you want to give them?" I closed my eyes and thought of Saturday's party, my mother's smug voice on the phone, Emma's laughter, her word handout. 30 days, I said. "I want them to know they have a month." "I can prepare the paperwork tomorrow afternoon," he replied, "and the same goes for the apartment where your sister is currently living." "Yes," I said, "that applies to both properties." There was a pause and David asked, "Carolyn, can I ask what's going on here? This sounds sudden." I gave him a brief rundown of the situation, the Facebook post, the public blackmail, the threats to my career. David whistled. "Wow," he said. "Okay, we'll prepare the paperwork immediately. But Carolyn, you need to document everything. Save those posts. Record the conversations, if that's allowed in your state. That could get you into serious trouble." I smiled bitterly, even though he couldn't see me. "I'm already ahead of you on that, David." After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair and for the first time in weeks, felt the corners of my lips tugging upward. It wasn't a warm, kind smile, but something sharp, like a knife, something predatory. They wanted to play games with me, and fine, I was ready, but let them understand up front that they had chosen the wrong opponent, and all their tricks, backroom calls, and dirty online posts would seem like child's play next to what I had prepared. Saturday arrived and I went to Romano's, surprisingly calm, as if everything inside me had calmed down with the decision I had made, as if the road had already been cleared and all that remained was to walk it. That morning, I'd picked up the eviction papers from David, and now they sat in my bag, neatly bound, sealed, signed, cold and merciless as a death sentence. And I knew that's exactly how they would look to my family, official and final. When I walked into the restaurant, the air was thick with the smell of food and wine, balloons were everywhere, and a large banner with the name Emma shone over the long table, and everything looked exactly the way my mother liked it. Loud, ostentatious, expensive, and with that veneer of decorum that always hid her greed. As she'd promised, there were about 50 guests, distant relatives I hadn't seen in years, Emma's college friends, neighbors, familiar families, all of them sitting with drinks and laughing as if life around them was easy and beautiful. I noticed Emma right away. She was wearing a new dress, a light one, clearly made of expensive fabric, and she was laughing among her friends. When she saw me, she waved and smiled so sincerely that something in my chest fluttered, and for a moment I felt awkward, thinking I was about to ruin this window dressing of happiness. But Mom didn't let me dwell on that feeling. She was almost immediately there, leaning closer and whispering, "Carolyn, did you bring the papers?" There was a hint of steel in her voice and a coldness in her eyes, the same one I'd known since childhood, when any "no" from me turned into a storm. "We'll see, Mom," I replied, and I felt Steve already reaching out to me, hugging me awkwardly like a stranger, saying with strained warmth, "Good to see you, Carolyn." "Big day for Emma, huh?" I merely nodded. Of course. I chatted with my relatives, ate, smiled, pretended everything was fine, but deep down I knew my mother was watching me, waiting, barely hiding her impatient certainty that I would play along in her performance today. And then, when the moment for the toasts arrived, the guests began to rise one by one, raise their glasses, and make sweet speeches about Emma's accomplishments, how smart she was, how proud they were of her, how bright her future was. It all sounded beautiful and sincere, but to me it was like distant noise because I was waiting for my moment. And it arrived when my mother stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate Emma's graduation. And I have a special announcement," she said, pausing and then looking directly at me. "Emma's older sister, Carolyn, has some exciting news to share about her graduation gift." In a split second, everyone's faces turned to me, and I felt dozens of expectant gazes on me. Mom smiled her theatrical smile, but her eyes were icy, full of command. I slowly stood up and looked around the room. These people thought they'd witness a moment of family generosity, that I'd hand my sister the keys to the apartment and everyone would clap and cry with emotion, but they had no idea what was about to happen. "Thank you, Mom," I began calmly, "but I have my own announcement." I took out my phone, opened the recording app, and said, "I always record conversations. It's part of my job in PR because people often say one thing in meetings and then pretend it never happened. I've been thinking a lot about Emma's gift this week, and I've decided I won't give anything." The room erupted in a roar. Gasps and whispers erupted. Emma's face went white and my mother froze, her mouth hanging open. "You see, my family tried to blackmail me into giving Emma the apartment I inherited. They posted lies on social media, threatened my career, tried to corner me, and I decided everyone needed to hear the real story." I pressed play, and my mother's voice, hoarse and cold, filled the restaurant. "I posted this so you couldn't refuse. Emma's graduation is at Romano's on Saturday. You need to bring the apartment and deeds. If you don't, I'll tell everyone you're lying. You work in public relations, Carolyn. How will it look if you can't be trusted?" The recording lasted 2 minutes, and at that moment the restaurant was so silent you could hear a pin drop. When it ended, I put the phone away and pulled the papers out of my bag. "What is this?" Mom whispered, her hands shaking as she unfolded the pages. "An eviction notice from the house where you live, the house that actually belongs to me, inherited from my grandmother. You have 30 days to find a new place to live." I turned to Emma, who was already crying, and handed her the exact same documents. "Same to you, sister." 30 days to move out. I glanced around the room, and I could see the same look on everyone's faces. Confusion, shock, almost fear, as if they had all simultaneously woken up from a dream where everything looked perfect and suddenly saw the real dirt hiding beneath the shiny packaging. "Since everyone's here, I think you should know the truth," I said loudly, so even those standing in the far corner could hear. "The house they live in is mine." It's been that way for a year now. I let them stay there because I thought we were family. But as it turns out, I was wrong. Mom sat with the documents in her hands, her fingers shaking so hard the pages rustled like dry leaves. She stared at the signatures and seals, as if hoping the letters would transform themselves into a different truth. "It can't be legal," she muttered finally, her voice breaking. "If you want, call a lawyer," I replied calmly, feeling everything inside me build into a solid wall. "But I'm sure you'll see it's perfectly legal." I turned to Emma, whose eyes were streaked with black mascara. "Congratulations on graduating, little sister. Welcome to adulthood." I didn't say anything else, just turned and walked toward the exit, feeling dozens of gazes piercing my back, but not looking back because I knew this moment would remain theirs, etched in their memories forever. I walked out of the restaurant and breathed in the night air, and for the first time in weeks, my chest expanded easily, without heaviness, without that sticky fear. When I got home, my phone vibrated before I even got out of the car. Mom's name was flashing on the screen. I hung up. Immediately, another call. Emma, then Steve, then Mom, again. By the time I got up to my apartment, there were 12 of them, and my voicemail was full. I didn't even listen. I just poured myself a large glass of wine, sat on the couch, and watched the city lights flicker in the window, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt free of their expectations, their pressure, their dirty games. My phone kept vibrating while I sipped my wine, and finally, out of curiosity, I opened the messages. "Carolyn, please call me. We need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding," my mom wrote. "You can't do this to us." "Where are we supposed to live?" Emma added. "This is crazy, Carolyn." "Your mom is having a panic attack," Steve texted. Then my mom again, "I'm sorry." "Okay, I'm sorry. Please don't do this to your family, Emma. I'm your sister." "How can you be so cruel?" And my mom again, "We raised you better." I couldn't help but laugh out loud. They raised me? My mom, who gave up her parental rights when I was 13? My grandmother raised me, and it's only because of her that I'm even human. I turned off my phone and went to bed relieved, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The next morning, at precisely 8 o'clock, there was a loud knock on the door, and I trudged angrily to the peephole. All 3 of us were standing there. Mom's eyes were red and puffy, Emma looked like she hadn't slept a wink, and Steve looked confused and depressed. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "What do you want?" I asked coldly. Mom immediately burst into tears. "Carolyn, honey, I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I just wanted to help Emma start her life, but things went wrong." "You were trying to blackmail me," I reminded her. I know, and I'm so sorry, but please, you can't kick us out of our house. We've lived there for 20 years. "It was never your home," I interrupted. "It was Grandma's house, and she let you live there out of kindness." Steve stepped forward, putting his hands in his pockets. "Carolyn, be reasonable. We can't just find a new place to live in 30 days. You know how expensive rent is these days. You should have thought of this earlier when you decided to steal my apartment," I said, my voice firm without hesitation. Emma couldn't hold back anymore, wiping away her tears with her palms. "Where should I go? I don't have a job. I don't have money for rent." "Figure it out," I replied. "You're an adult now. Remember?" Mom grabbed my hand, squeezing her fingers as if she wanted to hold me by force. "Please, Carolyn. We're family, and family forgives each other." I pulled my hand away. "Family doesn't blackmail or threaten each other. Remember that." And then Steve said something unexpected. "What if we pay you rent? We could sign a contract and pay every month." I looked at him. At least he was the only one trying to think practically. "How much?" I asked. Mom jumped in immediately. "Whatever. We just need a place to live." I calculated it in my head. Their house would have been listed at around $1,500 a month, but after everything they'd done, I decided to lower the price just enough to hurt them, but be manageable. $1,200 for the house, I said, and Emma can stay in the apartment for $1,000. Emma's eyes widened in horror. $1,000? I don't have a job. Then you should find one soon or move back in with Mom and Steve, I replied. The choice is yours. Mom nodded frantically as if clutching a lifeline, and her voice trembled as she repeated, "Yes. Yes, we can pay $1,200. She looked up at me like a schoolgirl caught stealing, and I could almost feel her wanting to fall to her knees, but her pride wouldn't allow it. "When do we start paying?" I asked dryly, not giving her time for more tears. "The down payment is due in a week," she replied hastily, and I quickly added, "Miss the payment, and you're out immediately." There won't be a second chance. Steve exhaled as if a sack of bricks had been lifted from his shoulders and said, "It's fair. We can do it." His eyes cleared for the first time, and I realized he was glad for some certainty. Emma, meanwhile, continued to sob, wiping her snot with her sleeve, sniffling, "I can't afford $1,000 a month." I shrugged and said coolly, then move out. I can easily rent this apartment to someone else for $1,500. There'll be a line of people wanting it. Mom immediately turned to Emma, hugging her shoulders as if to hide her behind her back. "You'll come home, darling. Everything will be fine." Emma glared at me so viciously that if she'd had the strength, she would have stabbed me right there in the doorway. But she really had no choice. "I need to sign the lease by tomorrow," I continued firmly, "and I want the first month's rent in advance." They all nodded like mad puppets whose strings had been pulled, and in that moment, I felt the power flowing through me, cold and confident. After they left, I immediately called David to have the lease drawn up properly, and then called the management company to take over Grandma's apartment as soon as Emma vacated it. The next day, Mom and Steve, true to their word, signed the papers and shoved $1,200 in cash into my hands, while Emma, clenching her teeth, packed her things and returned to her childhood bedroom, cowering in humiliation and powerlessness. A week later, I put the apartment on the market, and a pretty graduate student quickly found a partner who happily agreed to pay $1,500 a month for a cozy place in a good neighborhood. As the money started pouring in from both sides, Mom and Steve and the new tenant, I suddenly realized I was getting an extra $2,700 a month, and it felt like a gift from above. I used it to make early mortgage payments, and for the first time in my life, I felt in control not only of my destiny, but also of my future. Mom now faithfully transfers the rent electronically every month so we don't have to see each other. The management company handles all the apartment matters, and I no longer have to hear a single excuse or sob story. Since that morning when they came begging at my door, I haven't spoken to them once. Emma sometimes sends angry messages complaining about having to live with her parents again, but I don't even open them. I just delete them like trash. A few months ago, I ran into my mom's old neighbor at the store. She recognized me and said with a smile, "How generous of you to let my family rent from you at such a reasonable price." I just chuckled and said, "Thank you." Generosity wasn't the right word for it, but I didn't argue. Honestly, I stopped considering them family a long time ago. They showed who they really were when they decided they could manipulate and threaten me. Now they're just tenants, business partners who faithfully transfer money to me every month. Meanwhile, I made new friends at work, allowed myself to open up to the world again, joined a book club, and those evenings spent reading and discussing reminded me of my childhood with my grandmother, when she taught me to love words and believe in myself. My life has become calm, free of drama, and it's a silence I treasure. Sometimes I think about my grandmother and what she would have said about all this. I'm sure she would have been proud of me, because she always said, "Be strong and don't let people take advantage of your kindness." She used to say that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's a doormat to be trampled on. And I learned this lesson the hard way, but the right way. They wanted to deceive me and rob me, but it turned out the opposite. Now they're paying me. They thought they were cunning, but they forgot one thing. I'm no longer that timid girl who babysat for free and kept silent out of fear. I'm now a grown, successful woman who owns real estate and knows how to protect herself. And I sleep soundly at night knowing this, because I no longer have anything to fear.